Hey everybody, this is just intended to be a pretty minimal background explanation of Karl Marx, just to talk about his history and about kind of like what we do with this with this philosophy, right, as we're reading it. You may or may not know, and it's okay either way, that Marx is writing largely in kind of response to mass industrialization. And so industrialization is this period of very rapid growth and change. Basically, like it is this time in life where people largely lived in rural areas, lived off the land, and because of the way that the economy transformed, they were now living in cities, working in factories, right? Doing labor kind of alongside other people for other people. And there are all kinds of things about industrialization that we'll probably talk about in class on Monday. Around like where Marx thinks this is really important. But this is just a huge time of social upheaval, right? And so it's really, of course, it makes sense, right, that a lot of our early philosophers are going to say like, hey, things are really changing because it's a really big deal because at the time society is really changing. So important for Marx at this time is also that there is this huge major shift in the class structure. So kind of prior to the Industrial Revolution and industrialization, there were certainly nobles, right? There were certainly people that were very wealthy. But class was incredibly bimodal, where there are these like really rich people, and then there are peasants, right? And there's not really much in between. This kind of rise of industrialization allows a middle class to emerge, right? So we have owners through this capitalistic system really starting to emerge. And not necessarily that there is a three-class system. In fact, as we'll read, Marx rejects this entirely, right? He thinks that this rise of the middle class is in fact actually a pretty false thing, that we shouldn't read too much into it, right? But it is just a kind of a shuffling of a very bifurcated class system. But it is the first time where we've seen kind of rifts between like or something else, right, between haves and have-nots, or at least as Marx will come to see it, because he thinks this middle class, or what he will call the petite bourgeoisie, that they are not actually the haves, right? That they're just have-nots who we all believe are haves, and we'll read much more about that later this week. In terms of thinking about this, right, he really wants to understand that this change in working conditions really affects everything, right? And another thing that he's writing in response to is the ideas of Hegel, who is a German philosopher, and Marx is what they call a young Hegelian at the time. So I suppose we should probably go back and kind of talk about his own upbringing. So Marx is one of 9 children. He's the third of 9 children in his family, and his parents are kind of like bureaucrats / intellectuals, right? So where they're not, they would be in this kind of petite bourgeoisie class that he writes about later when we start reading the readings that we'll do for Wednesday. So they've got like a little bit of means, but not, they're kind of I don't want to say struggling, right? But they're also extremely religiously persecuted. So Marx grows up Jewish. He actually becomes Lutheran to become engaged in the tradition of Lutheran higher education, what PLU, right, and LHE. Like at the time, Lutheran higher education is seen as the pinnacle of education, right? It was one of the only education traditions. So hopefully you know this, right? But if not, now's the time. Lutheran higher education is all about questioning, right? And not assuming that, not taking any knowledge for granted, and making sure that you kind of ask questions, that you're a lifelong learner, and that you're kind of always in the spirit of understanding. And, prior to their kind of emergence of Lutheran higher education and Lutheranism, like we kind of we particularly didn't question religion, right? And so Marx was, his parents wanted him raised in Lutheran education to be able to go to Lutheran schools. So he becomes Lutheran baptized, but that doesn't kind of mask for people that he is Jewish at a time where there's lots of persecution of Jews, right? And so, Marx kind of is always on the outside of social groups, right? So be it in terms of his class, because he's not quite peasant, but certainly not noble. In terms of religious, he is kind of in school with and in community with with the Lutheran Prussians, who were the massive, the powerful group at the time, but kind of still seen as a Jewish outsider within there. And is seen as a political outsider as well. And so Marx goes to school. He goes to college, does pretty well. Really is interested in studying law, and so starts studying law. But then, as he starts reading philosophy in part of his legal studies, that's when he decides that he really wants to kind of do more social philosophy. Although his form of social philosophy is much more invested in kind of journalism, kind of for two reasons, right? So for one reason, he is largely denied place in the academy because of religious persecution, because of the fact that there just isn't a lot of opportunity for Jews to have those kinds of posts and positions. A lot of universities are religiously affiliated at the time, and so it's less of an option, right, for him. He also, though, as we'll come to see for our readings on Wednesday, believes that part of the reason of studying social philosophy is to change the world for better, right? And so, he kind of wants to do journalism / activism that is wildly unpopular at the time, right? And so, kind of for a couple reasons. One, because he believes that that is the way that you should do social science, and also because he is shut out of the academy, right? It kind of lends him more to doing this kind of journalistic work. So kind of backing track to this idea of Marx starting from a place of Hegelianism, or particularly left Hegelianism, or being a young Hegelian. Hegel basically believes that we're marching towards progression, right? So that society kind of moves forward, that movement comes from power, and that ultimately we're going to end up in a place of utopia, right? That it's going to happen. We're getting better, we keep getting better, and we're going to end up being better, in part because of this idea of the dialectic, which we'll see Marx really engage in our readings for Monday, but hit in every single iteration of Marxism. You'll run into this idea of the dialectic. And the dialectic is basically just this notion that, within certain concepts, you have both the conditions of doing and undoing, right? And so, for instance, most classically, Marx points out the dialectic within capitalism, because in a structure where you kind of get the resources and power concentrated in the hands of a few, then you have the masses without power, right? That's the inherent design of capitalism. And so for Marx, right, the creation of capitalism also creates the nature of it being overthrown, because effectively, as soon as people say, what? This isn't working for us. As long as they collectively do it, then the workers can always overthrow the owners, right? There's just too many workers for that not to happen. And so that's kind of the idea of a dialectic. But Marx breaks with Hegel and Hegelians for a couple reasons. So one that we'll read about a lot in the economic and German manuscripts is that, most important, he sees the material conditions, which means the economy, right, or who owns what, is actually what makes societies change. Hegel and company, the other Hegelians, traditional Hegelians, or the right Hegelians, as they're called in philosophy, they kind of see that values, and that's kind of going to come more in with Weber, but laws in particular, most important with Hegel, that laws create the economy, right? And so the power structure, governance, whatever, right, governments create allow people freedoms, particularly as we get around democracy, right? And people have these opportunities to do their own thing. And so that then lets the economy kind of produce, right? And advance. And so they advance together. Marx is going to flip that and say, actually, no, right? Like what holds society together, what creates our economy, our politics, our norms, right? Like all of that is actually going to be designed by how we are materially arranged, or our relationship to what is, kind of like good, and or what is owned in the economy, how the economy is ran, right? So the economy is what kind of makes things get better. So Marx is actually quite optimistic, and we'll kind of see this particularly reading the Communist Manifesto, which I think a lot of people before they read it don't think of it as the kind of like a treatise in optimism, but it absolutely is, in part because Marx thinks that because capitalism creates its own undoing, utopia is next. So he very much holds into Hegel that is the case, right? And as we'll see, that, like because of him, once we allow people to find the human condition, which he will tell us is our ability to labor and create, that through that, we will decide to labor for one another, with one another, alongside one another in a kind of common instance, right? That is his definition of socialism, right? Like we give what we can because we are finding our passion, and we are absolutely willing, because we find our passion in our work, to share and divvy out with other people. And so, like in terms of all of this, we'll certainly see Marx absolutely hates capitalism, right? And we'll see that. And at the time it makes sense, right? So most adults were working 70 plus hours a week in these factories. Most children, as young as 6 years old, were working 50 plus hours a week in really poor living and working conditions. People were basically doing all this work and just barely above starving. And a lot of them were getting hurt and maimed in their working conditions, right? So it's a very, very bad situation, right? And so it is, or at least in terms of the morals at the time and our morals now, right? And so it makes sense that Marx would think that this was kind of not the best thing. So in terms of thinking about, like this activist Marx, and, we'll talk about this in class, but, he really, really wanted to be a scholar, but becomes an activist because he gets kind of pushed out of that, right? And, a lot of people have questions. So I want to kind of address his relationship with Frederick Engels. So Engels, if you want to think about it in modern terms, he was kind of like the head GoFundMe of Karl Marx, like, right? He was like his lead patron. At the time, that's what we did for academics, like, right, in the same way right now we do that for a lot of our cultural creators, where we might decide like, hey, I really like your music, or I really like your podcast, so I'm going to give you, a couple bucks a month to do that thing that I like. At the time, people did that a lot more with ideas, right? And so you had people, so Engels was a textiles, was his family he had lots of familial wealth, and he's like, hey, Marx, I like your ideas, so I'm going to give you money to be able to write and stuff, right? And so so he kind of made that possible for Marx to keep writing, particularly as a lot of, Marx gets excommunicated or exiled from like 2 countries. There's tons of prosecution, et cetera, right? And that, this is absolutely important in Marx's writing to some extent, but it also feels kind of more gossipy than his, kind of overall, sorry, I lost my. Okay, I said it paused for a second, so hopefully that's not the case. So, in terms of thinking about this, right, like Marx, he's arguing with Hegel, he's arguing with Adam Smith, we'll kind of see this. But, as we read for today, he wants us to kind of to be thinking about this idea of thesis and antithesis, right? So in this dialectic process, which he defines as anything where a given state or being or idea contains within itself the seeds of an opposing state or of being or opposing idea. So effectively, like where there is utopia, there is dystopia. Where there's good, there is evil, right? Where there is progression, there is halting. All of these kinds of things, right, like are important. And so Marx wants us to think about where the dialectic is and what it means when we have dialectic processes. He also wants us to think about, to be thinking about, like, what is the problems of having a ruling class that is not the mass class? So when we have people who are in power that are not the majority of people, what does that mean? And what does it mean to be thinking about undoing the power structure, right? And so he's thinking about capitalism. A lot of us now are thinking about capitalism, right? It's something that is kind of in the zeitgeist of the modern idea. And so if we dismantle, replace, change capitalism, how would that happen? Would it be through law? Would it be through activism? Would it be through revolt? Who would lead that, right? And so Marx is going to give us these very clear ideas that he thinks that it is going to be through worker action, but do we think that's true, right? Like, what could law do? What could activism do? What could philanthropy do, right? Like, we should think about that. What has the power to undo capitalism or change capitalism in the modern state? Also to be thinking about, like, what is the driver of our life? For Marx, again, Marx thinks that people are producers, that we are laborers, that is what we produce and how we produce it is what defines us. And is that true, right? Is that true or not true? So all these questions to think about as you're reading Marx, and certainly, if you have any other questions, let me know. We'll talk about it in class, I imagine, a great deal. So I hope you have fun reading this and thinking about some of these ideas.